Picture this. The most powerful man in America stands behind a podium, convinced he's about to deliver the knockout punch that will destroy his predecessor's legacy forever. He's got what he believes is smoking gun evidence, a secret recording that will finally prove Barack Obama is unfit for leadership. But in the next 7 minutes, something extraordinary happens. Something that turns political strategy into political suicide. Something that reminds an entire nation what they've been missing. This is the story of how one man's attempt to tear down another became the greatest gift he could have given his enemy. And it all began in the most unlikely place, a White House press briefing that nobody expected to make history. The tension in that briefing room was electric. You could practically taste it in the air. Reporters clutched their notebooks tighter than usual. Cameras lined every available inch of wall space. And seasoned journalists who'd seen it all knew something big was coming. When Donald Trump finally strode to that podium, his jaw set with determination, nobody could predict what was about to unfold. Trump didn't waste a single second on pleasantries. No talk of economic numbers, no foreign policy updates, no standard presidential fare. Instead, he launched straight into what can only be described as a verbal assault on Barack Obama. The words cut through the room like a blade through silk. Barack Obama was unfit to lead then, and he's unfit to have influence now. The reaction was immediate. Pens froze mid-sentence. Eyebrows shot up across the room. Journalists who thought they'd heard every possible attack in modern politics suddenly realized they were witnessing something different, something bigger, something that felt like it could change everything. A Washington Post reporter leaned forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "Mr. President, are you saying the former president is actively working against your administration?" Trump's response sent chills through the room. Not only was he saying exactly that, but he had proof, audio proof, and everyone was about to hear it. The silence that followed was deafening. Not a cough, not a shuffle of papers, nothing. Veteran reporters who'd covered wars and scandals felt their hearts racing. They were on the precipice of a story that could explode in every direction imaginable. Then came the moment that changed everything. A laptop appeared, carried by a staffer and placed carefully on the podium. Trump tapped the microphone, leaned in close, and delivered the words that would haunt him for weeks to come. "We have a recording. It's Obama himself. You'll see what I mean." The anticipation was suffocating. Michael Rodriguez from NBC whispered to his colleague, "This could change everything." Others began scribbling frantically, desperate to capture every word, every gesture, every nuance of what felt like a historic moment in the making. Trump savored the moment, his eyes scanning the room with satisfaction. He'd built this up perfectly. Years of claiming Obama was never fit for leadership, and now he finally had the evidence to prove it. "Don't just take my word," he declared. Listen to his own words. The button was pressed. The speakers crackled to life. And then something nobody expected happened. Out of those speakers came not the voice of a conspirator, not the words of someone undermining America, but something entirely different. Barack Obama's voice, unmistakable and calm, began to fill the room with words that would turn Trump's carefully planned attack inside out. "Thank you all for being here today." Obama's voice began, measured and steady. "I know times feel uncertain, and many of you wonder if your efforts matter, but I'm here to tell you they do. Every conversation you have, every young person you mentor, every time you remind someone that this country belongs to all of us, you're shaping the future." The confusion in that room was palpable. Reporters glanced at each other, eyebrows furrowed, trying to understand what a scandal was. Where was the betrayal? Where was the evidence of unfitness? Instead, what they heard sounded presidential, inspiring, even. Trump stood there, arms crossed, confident that the recording would vindicate his accusations. But with every word that spilled from those speakers, it became clearer that something had gone terribly wrong with his plan. A journalist in the back whispered what everyone was thinking. Where's the attack? Where's the betrayal? But the tape kept playing, and Obama's voice continued its steady, reassuring cadence. He spoke about community leaders in Detroit, about resilience, about teaching young people that democracy wasn't something handed down from above, but something that had to be fought for, protected, and nurtured by ordinary citizens. The contrast was stunning, almost cinematic in its irony. Here was Trump, having built up this moment as the ultimate exposure of his predecessor's unfitness. But what the room heard instead was a masterclass in leadership. One cameraman, known for his stone-faced professionalism, quietly muttered words that captured the moment perfectly. "This is actually moving." The energy in the room had completely shifted. What started as anticipation for a political scandal had transformed into something else entirely. A reminder of a different kind of leadership, a different tone, a different way of speaking to the American people. Obama's words continued to flow. Our democracy survives not because of one leader, but because of millions of voices refusing to give up on one another. By this point, reporters weren't scribbling as frantically. They were listening, really listening, and many of them were beginning to realize that they weren't witnessing Obama's downfall. They were watching Trump hand his predecessor the greatest gift he could have asked for. A CNN correspondent leaned over to her colleague and whispered what would prove prophetic. If this is the best he's got, this might backfire. But the real shock hadn't even hit yet. As Obama's voice grew stronger and the room leaned deeper into his message, something unprecedented was about to happen that would send this story spinning in a direction absolutely nobody had predicted. The recording continued, and with each passing minute, it became more obvious that Trump had fundamentally misunderstood what he was playing. Obama wasn't yelling. He wasn't accusing anyone of anything. He was teaching, guiding, encouraging like a mentor who understood that his audience needed hope more than they needed criticism. The strength in his voice wasn't the kind that came from tearing others down. It was the kind that came from building others up. Trump scanned a crowd of reporters, expecting gasps of outrage, maybe even confirmation of his accusations. Instead, he saw furrowed brows, skeptical looks, and pens that had slowed to a crawl. The recording didn't sound incriminating at all. If anything, it sounded like what many people remembered leadership used to sound like. Obama's words continued painting a picture that no amount of framing could distort. The strength of our country is not measured by the titles of the people in office. It's measured by the kindness of neighbors in Flint who check in on one another, by teachers in Detroit who refuse to give up on their students, by parents in Milwaukee who work 3 jobs. Just keep the lights on. For some reporters, it was impossible not to remember Obama's speeches from years earlier, the ones that had made him a household name, that had inspired a generation, that rhythm, that calm cadence. It was unmistakable and undeniably powerful. But Trump wasn't backing down. Unwilling to break his gaze from the crowd, he leaned into the microphone again, his voice sharp with frustration. You hear that? That's what he really thinks. He doesn't believe in strong leadership. He believes in weak communities. He believes in letting others run the country instead of the people we elect. That's when Rebecca Lynn from the Boston Globe decided to speak up. Her words, delivered carefully but pointedly, captured what everyone in the room was thinking. Mr. President, with all due respect, that doesn't sound like undermining. That sounds like encouragement. Trump's face hardened visibly. Encouragement? That's weakness. We need strength. We don't need lectures about neighbors or families. We need real leaders. And Obama has never been one. The tension in the room escalated dramatically. Some reporters tried to hide their surprise. Others couldn't quite mask their smirks. But the audio kept running, completely ignoring the heated commentary swirling around it. On the recording, a young man's voice could be heard asking Obama a question that resonated far beyond that original room in Detroit. What do we do when we feel like we can't make a difference, Mr. President? Obama's reply came without hesitation, and it would be quoted thousands of times in the days that followed. You remind yourself that history is not written by cynics. It's written by those who keep pushing even when the odds are against them. Change never comes easy. It takes patience, persistence, and above all, belief in each other. At that moment, something remarkable happened in the briefing room. Some reporters stopped taking notes entirely. They weren't documenting anymore. They were just listening, absorbing words that felt alive and relevant despite being recorded months earlier at a closed-door session in Detroit. Trump, however, wasn't swayed. He jabbed a finger at the press corps. You think that's leadership? That's weakness talking. That's a man trying to tell young people not to fight hard, but to stay quiet. That's when Anthony Ross from Reuters spoke up from the back of the room, his voice cutting through the tension. "Sir, with all due respect, that's not what it sounds like. He's saying the opposite. That persistence is necessary. Are you certain this is the right clip?" For the first time since the press conference began, a flicker of genuine frustration crossed Trump's face. He waved his hand dismissively. "You people will twist anything to protect him, but the truth is right here on tape." Yet even as Trump spoke, Obama's voice continued its steady flow from the speakers, delivering words that would echo far beyond that briefing room. Leadership isn't about tearing others down to prove your own strength. It's about lifting people up so that they can carry the torch when you're gone. An audible murmur ran through the crowd of reporters. Some even raised their eyebrows in obvious appreciation. Trump's aides along the wall looked increasingly uncomfortable. This wasn't the reaction they had expected or planned for. The recording was supposed to be a political weapon, but instead it was becoming something else entirely. A gift that Obama never intended for the public, but that was resonating with them anyway. Rebecca Lynn leaned over to a colleague and whispered what many were thinking. If anything, he just gave Obama free airtime. Her colleague nodded silently, eyes locked on a laptop, waiting for what would come next. Obama's voice delivered what felt like a final, decisive blow, soft but piercing in its power. America is not the sum of its divisions. It's the measure of how we rise above them together. The room fell silent once more, and for a long, breathless moment, the only sound was the recording itself. Then, without warning, Trump slapped the laptop closed with a sharp crack. The speakers went dead instantly. "Enough," he said firmly, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "You've heard it. Now you know the truth." But the silence that followed wasn't agreement. It was disbelief. Reporters looked at one another with expressions that ranged from confusion to amazement to barely suppressed laughter. Many were wondering if Trump even realized the magnitude of what he had just done. A journalist from Politico muttered under his breath what would prove to be one of the most accurate predictions of the day. He might have just handed Obama the biggest PR win of the year. Trump gathered his notes, clearly ready to move on to safer topics. But the damage was already done. Reporters weren't thinking about policy announcements or routine briefings anymore. They were thinking about what they had just witnessed and how to tell this incredible story to the world. But the real shock wouldn't come from that press room. It would come from outside, where the recording was about to take on a life of its own, spreading across the internet like wildfire and reaching millions of Americans who would have their own reactions to what they heard. Within minutes of the press conference ending, the transformation began. Reporters rushed out of the White House briefing room with their phones already glued to their ears and laptops opening before they'd even reached their cars. In our hyper-connected age, where a single sentence can trend worldwide in under 5 minutes, this was political dynamite. But here was the incredible irony. The explosion wasn't hurting Barack Obama at all. It was devastating Donald Trump. Cable networks scrambled to react. CNN, MSNBC, and even Fox News cut into their regular programming to play the audio. In glass-wall control rooms across the country, producers shouted orders. "Get the tape up now. Run it again." The Obama clip wasn't scandalous. It was calm, eloquent, and deeply American. That irony made it absolutely irresistible for broadcast. On MSNBC, anchor Joy Michaels leaned forward in her chair, listening to playback in her earpiece before speaking to millions of viewers. That's not an indictment of Obama. That's a reminder of the kind of leadership we don't hear much anymore. Her co-anchor nodded silently, watching the teleprompter scroll past with words that captured the surreal nature of what they were covering. But television was just the beginning. Social media caught fire in ways that political strategists study for years afterward. Twitter exploded with hashtags. Hashtag Obamape and hashtag Leadership Matters climbed to the top of the trending list within hours. Clips of Obama's most powerful lines were already being stitched into TikTok videos, paired with images of everyday Americans. Teachers in Cleveland classrooms, volunteers at Houston food banks, nurses in Des Moines hospitals. On Instagram, a young woman from Phoenix posted a story that captured what millions were feeling. Say what you want about politics, but these words still give me hope. Within minutes, thousands of comments poured in, many echoing the same sentiment. This doesn't sound like unfitness. It sounds like exactly what we're missing. Meanwhile, in living rooms across America, the reaction was immediate and visceral. In Toledo, Ohio, 58-year-old truck driver Alan Pierce sat in his worn recliner, remote in hand, watching CNN replay the recording for the third time. He shook his head slowly and said to his wife, "I didn't even vote for the guy back then, but damn, that sounds like a leader." His wife, Carol, who was folding laundry nearby, glanced up at the screen. "Compared to what we've been hearing lately, it's night and day," she replied quietly. In Phoenix, high school senior Danielle Morales sat cross-legged on her family's couch, her phone buzzing with notifications as the clip spread through her social networks. She played the recording aloud for her mother, who was chopping vegetables in the nearby kitchen. "See, Mom, this is what we were talking about in class. He's telling us we matter," Danielle said, her voice filled with something that had been missing from political discourse. Genuine inspiration. Her mother wiped her hands on a towel and listened for a moment, her expression softening. "He's not even president anymore," she observed, "but he still sounds like one." The irony was deepening by the hour. The very recording that Trump believed would damage Obama was being embraced across the country as a reminder of dignity and steadiness in politics. Americans weren't hearing weakness in those words. They were hearing hope, leadership, and a vision of what the country could be. But the reaction wasn't universally positive. In a diner off Route 66 in Amarillo, Texas, a group of older men in baseball caps leaned across their booth, debating fiercely. One slammed his coffee mug down hard enough to rattle the table. "Don't you get it? He's trying to sound noble, but it's all about control. That's what Trump was warning us about." His friend, quieter and more thoughtful, stirred his black coffee slowly before replying. Maybe he's just saying we've got to believe in each other. Doesn't sound so bad to me." These conversations were multiplying everywhere, in barbershops on college campuses, in factory lunchrooms. People were arguing because the words had hit them. They had to decide what those words meant. And that decision was forcing Americans to confront their own values and expectations about leadership. Meanwhile, inside the White House, Trump's staff was in crisis mode. They huddled in the West Wing, their faces grim as they watched the clip air on every major network. Polling analysts were already warning that the optics were disastrous. "We gave him a microphone," one aide muttered under his breath to another, "and he stole the room." Back at his home in Chicago, Obama hadn't spoken publicly about the incident yet, but those close to him said he wasn't surprised. He had been speaking to community leaders that day in Detroit with no expectation of publicity. His words weren't crafted as a political attack. They were meant to be encouragement for young activists and community organizers. Now those same words were ricocheting across the country, finding life in the most unexpected corners of American society. In Detroit, 23-year-old Malika Foster, who had been in the original audience when the recording was made, posted a video on Facebook that would be shared thousands of times. "I was there when he said those things. He looked us straight in the eyes. It didn't feel like politics. It felt like someone telling us not to give up on ourselves. And now the whole world gets to hear it." Even late-night comedians joined the cultural moment. One grinning host leaned into his camera and delivered a line that would be quoted for weeks. "Trump tried to drop a bomb on Obama, but it turned out to be a bouquet." His audience roared with laughter, but beneath the humor was a recognition of just how spectacularly Trump's strategy had backfired. By midnight, the story was no longer about whether Obama was unfit for leadership. It had become about how Trump had managed to turn a routine community speech into a viral moment that had repolished Obama's image and reminded millions of Americans what they felt they were missing in their current leadership. Political analysts were calling it one of the most stunning backfires in modern political history. But the true test wasn't in the headlines or the hashtags. It was in how ordinary Americans would carry those words into the next day and what they would mean for the political conversation going forward. The morning after the press conference, the White House briefing room still carried the lingering smell of stale coffee and unresolved tension. Reporters filed in early, their conversations buzzing with analysis of what they had witnessed the day before. Some were replaying the clip on their phones for colleagues who hadn't been in the room, shaking their heads as if they still couldn't quite believe what had transpired. For those who had been there, the moment felt surreal in retrospect. Trump had stood tall and confident, absolutely convinced he was about to expose Barack Obama once and for all. And then Obama's voice, calm, reflective, layered with the kind of composure that people had grown to associate with real leadership, had filled the room instead, transforming what was meant to be a political execution into something entirely different. Laura Bennett from the Philadelphia Inquirer was on the phone with her editor, trying to explain the inexplicable. "I don't think you understand what happened in there." When that tape played, it was like the air itself shifted. We all expected something damaging, something scandalous, but it ended up sounding like a sermon on hope. The recording had run for nearly 7 minutes before Trump abruptly cut off. But those 7 minutes were replaying endlessly in the minds of everyone who had heard them. The sight of seasoned reporters leaning back in their chairs, exchanging bewildered glances, was almost as striking as the words themselves. Anthony Ross from Reuters would later describe the scene in an interview. "It was the strangest thing I've ever experienced in that room." Usually when the president makes an accusation like that, you get this flood of noise, questions, interruptions, challenges. But when Obama's voice came on, everything just stopped. People just listened. Even veteran journalists couldn't help but react openly to what they were hearing. Cameras had caught Rebecca Lynn scribbling just 3 words in her notebook as the audio rolled. "This is leadership." That image became a meme shared thousands of times online, amplifying the unintended effect of Trump's attempted attack. The shockwave didn't end with the reporters in that room. Cable news networks ran split screens throughout the night, replaying Obama's words on one side while showing Trump's increasingly expressionless face on the other. Pundits debated whether Trump had misunderstood the content of the tape or had been misled by aides who thought it sounded more damaging than it actually did. At a small coffee shop in Omaha, Nebraska, college students huddled around a laptop, replaying the footage and analyzing every detail. "Look at his face," one of them said, pointing at Trump on the screen. "He thinks he's landing a knockout punch, but he's actually giving his opponent center stage." His friend shook her head in amazement. "It's like handing your opponent a microphone in the middle of a boxing match." Inside the White House, damage control efforts began before dawn. A press release was hastily drafted, attempting to frame the recording as proof that Obama was inappropriately interfering in national affairs. But the language sounded forced and defensive, and by the time it reached journalists' inboxes, they had already crafted their own narrative. Trump's supposed smoking gun had turned into Obama's greatest gift. Even conservative commentators struggled with what had happened. On a late-night radio show in Dallas, host Carl Denton admitted to his audience, "I don't know what the president was thinking. That didn't sound like a man undermining America. It sounded like a man trying to hold it together." His phone lines lit up with callers who were evenly split, some agreeing with his assessment, others insisting it was evidence of coded manipulation from the former president. But the very fact that conservatives were divided among themselves showed just how unusual and unexpected the moment had been. Reporters who had been in the room began publishing personal accounts of the experience, each one echoing the same sense of disbelief. Headlines across the country carried words like misfire, backfire, and miscalculation. Political journalists couldn't remember another time when a sitting president had tried to discredit a predecessor and ended up making him look stronger instead. But perhaps the most telling sign of the cultural earthquake Trump had triggered came from the press pool itself. Normally, after a White House briefing, reporters shuffled quickly to their cars or workspace, eager to file their stories and move on to the next assignment. This time was different. Clusters of journalists lingered on the steps outside the building, replaying the clip on their phones and debating its meaning with the intensity of people who knew they had just witnessed something historic. The discussion wasn't about whether Obama looked bad. Everyone agreed he didn't. The debate was about whether Trump had just handed his predecessor a political resurrection that nobody, least of all Obama himself, had seen coming. Did you think he even realized what he was playing? One journalist asked her colleague as they stood in the crisp Washington air. The other reporter shrugged, still processing what they'd experienced. Doesn't matter now. Everyone's already writing their own version of this story, and none of them are good for Trump. The irony wasn't lost on anyone with even a basic understanding of politics. Trump, who had built his entire career on controlling narratives and dominating news cycles, had just set the stage for a story he could no longer own. The recording was out there, free from his context and interpretation, and Americans were making their own judgments about what they heard. That night, Obama's words found their way into classrooms, workplaces, and family kitchens across the country. The press had amplified them, but now the public was carrying them forward, sharing them person to person in ways that no political strategy could have planned or predicted. It wasn't just what Obama had said, it was how he had said it, calmly, thoughtfully, without the theatrical anger or performative outrage that had become so common in American politics. At a factory in Akron, Ohio, a worker named Maria Delgado replayed the clip on her phone during her lunch break. Her coworkers leaned in, chewing their sandwiches as Obama's voice filled the noisy break room. When the recording ended, one of them sighed deeply. "Man, that's different from what we usually hear these days." Maria nodded in agreement. "Feels like someone actually talking to us, not at us." The cultural impact wasn't being measured in poll numbers yet. It was being measured in conversations, in casual comments, in the way people were suddenly quoting a man who wasn't even running for office. But outside that briefing room, the story was gaining momentum beyond anything Trump's team could control. By the time dawn broke over Washington the next day, the clip had already reached millions of Americans. What had begun in a crowded White House briefing room was now in the hands of ordinary people scrolling through their social media feeds before heading to work. Students huddled over phones in school hallways, and night shift workers streaming the video during their breaks. Social media platforms exploded with activity. Twitter, recently rebranded as X, became a battleground of commentary and analysis. Memes spread faster than official statements could be written or responses crafted. Someone had clipped Obama's line about leadership not being about tearing others down and paired it with split-screen footage of Trump at the podium, scowling with frustration. The video was shared over 300,000 times within just a few hours. A new hashtag emerged organically from the grassroots response. Hashtag strengthened words began trending across the United States before most people had finished their morning coffee. On TikTok, creators were stitching Obama's calm words over footage of everyday American resilience. One particularly powerful video showed a single mother in Tulsa packing her children's lunches before heading to her second job, while Obama's voice provided the soundtrack. The strength of our country is not measured by the titles of the people in office. It's measured by parents in Milwaukee who work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. The comments section flooded with responses that captured the emotional impact. "This hits harder than any campaign ad ever could." The authenticity of matching Obama's words with real American struggles resonated in ways that professional political messaging rarely achieved. Instagram Reels told similar stories. A high school basketball coach in Sacramento uploaded a clip of his players running practice drills, with Obama's recording layered over slow-motion shots of teenagers pushing themselves to improve. His caption was simple but powerful. "This is what leadership sounds like." Within hours, the reel had accumulated tens of thousands of likes and hundreds of comments from people sharing their own stories of perseverance and hope. But nowhere was a cultural firestorm more visible than on YouTube, where dozens of channels reposted the entire 7-minute recording. Some added commentary and analysis. Others played it without interruption. But the view count soared into the millions. Comment sections became digital town halls, brimming with nostalgia, frustration, admiration, and every emotion in between, a tangled web of American feelings pouring out in real time. Say what you want about politics, but this guy could really speak to people. One user wrote, receiving thousands of likes and replies. Another countered, don't be fooled by pretty words. Look at his actual record. But the back-and-forth debate only made the clip spread faster, drawing more attention to Obama's message with every argument and discussion. In living rooms across the country, families found themselves having conversations about leadership and politics that they hadn't had in years. In Columbus, Ohio, 63-year-old Janice Walker played the recording for her grandchildren during their weekly visit. "Listen to this," she said, putting her phone on speaker and gathering the kids around the kitchen table. When Obama's words finished echoing through the room, her 12-year-old granddaughter asked a question that cut straight to the heart of the moment. "Grandma, why doesn't the president talk like that now?" Janice had no answer. How do you explain to a child that leadership styles change, that what sounds presidential to one generation might sound foreign to another? The silence that followed was filled with its own meaning. Meanwhile, in a small-town diner in Kansas, truckers taking their morning break found themselves in heated debates about the recording's significance. One driver insisted it was evidence that Obama was still trying to manipulate young people from behind the scenes. Another shook his head firmly, sipping his black coffee. No, that's just what it sounds like when a leader actually believes in people instead of just believing in himself. Their waitress, expertly balancing 3 plates while navigating the conversation, chimed in without missing a beat. "Sounds better than anything I've heard on the news in years." The clip had transcended its original political context. It wasn't just a piece of audio anymore. It had become a cultural mirror, forcing Americans to confront what they truly valued in their leaders. For some, it reignited long-dormant feelings of admiration and hope. For others, it raised suspicion and skepticism. But one truth was absolutely undeniable. It was getting people talking, thinking, and engaging with questions about leadership in ways they hadn't for a long time. Political strategists on both sides scrambled to understand and respond to the moment. Conservative talk radio hosts urged their listeners not to be swayed by what they called pretty speeches without substance. Progressive podcasters gushed that Obama's words were a powerful reminder of what authentic leadership used to sound like before politics became a blood sport. Even late-night comedians couldn't resist the setup. One host delivered a joke that perfectly captured the absurdity of the situation. Trump tried to play Obama like a villain in a movie, but America heard Morgan Freeman narrating a commercial for hope. The studio audience erupted in laughter, but beneath the humor was a recognition of the genuine cultural moment that was unfolding. But the online phenomenon wasn't just about jokes or partisan reactions. Something deeper and more significant was happening. Obama's words were being clipped into motivational videos, quoted in high school graduation speeches, and printed on homemade posters that appeared on school lockers across the country. Teachers were playing the audio in civics classes, asking their students fundamental questions about what leadership meant to them personally. In churches from coast to coast, pastors began weaving Obama's phrases into Sunday sermons about perseverance, faith, and community responsibility. The words had somehow transcended their political origins and become part of a broader conversation about American values and aspirations. Trump's communications team tried desperately to regain control of the narrative, insisting that the recording was clear proof of Obama's ongoing and inappropriate interference in current affairs. But their carefully crafted talking points fell flat against the organic grassroots response that was spreading across social media platforms and into everyday conversations. The internet had already decided what the moment meant, and no amount of official messaging could change that interpretation. Back in Detroit, where the recording had originally been made months earlier, the young community leaders who had been in that room felt a strange mixture of pride and surreal disbelief. 24-year-old Malika Foster, whose Facebook post about the original event had gone viral and made her something of a local spokesperson, told a television reporter, "We were just having a conversation about making a difference in our neighborhoods." None of us thought those words would ever be played in the White House press room. Now everyone across the country is talking about them. That's honestly pretty surreal. Her friend Jamal, who had also attended the original gathering, added his own perspective. When President Obama said history isn't written by cynics, it felt like he was talking directly to me personally. Now millions of people everywhere are hearing it the same way. That has to mean something important. What Trump had framed as evidence of weakness and unfitness was now being embraced by millions of Americans as proof of vision, hope, and genuine leadership. The cultural firestorm wasn't something that could be controlled by press releases, cable news spin, or even Trump's own prolific social media presence. By the end of that extraordinary day, polling organizations hadn't yet had time to measure the political impact with scientific precision, but the emotional and cultural sentiment was shifting in ways that experienced political observers could feel in the air. Inside living rooms, classrooms, and offices across America, Obama's words were being repeated, quoted, analyzed, and debated in ways that nobody, not even Obama himself, could have anticipated or planned. But the true test of this unprecedented moment wasn't going to be found in online reactions, viral memes, or trending hashtags. The real measure would come in the raw, unfiltered conversations happening face-to-face across America, where the recorder was transforming from a mere news headline into something much more profound, a fundamental question about what kind of leadership Americans actually wanted and deserved. The real impact of Obama's words wasn't being measured in retweets or trending topics. It was being measured in the way people suddenly found themselves pausing their daily routines to ask each other a simple but profound question. What do you think about that recording? For the first time in years, a political moment wasn't confined to Washington newsrooms or cable television debates. It had escaped into neighborhoods, small towns, and big cities, finding its way into every corner of everyday American life. In a laundromat in Dayton, Ohio, two women folded their clothes side by side, the steady hum of washing machines providing background noise to their conversation. One pulled out her smartphone, found the clip, and shook her head slowly as Obama's voice filled the steamy air. I don't care what political side you're on, she said, stuffing clean towels into her basket, but those words just make sense. That's the kind of message I wish my kids were hearing more often these days. The other woman, more skeptical by nature, shrugged as she matched pairs of socks. Yeah, maybe, but nice speeches don't pay the bills. Actions matter more than words. Still, even she couldn't deny that there was something compelling about the way Obama had spoken, something that felt different from the usual political noise. At a truck stop diner outside Tulsa, for drivers crowded into a worn vinyl booth, their conversation mixing with the clatter of plates and the hiss of the coffee machine. The waitress had just set down steaming plates of eggs and bacon when one of the men, Pete, leaned forward with the intensity of someone who'd been thinking about this all morning. When he said, "History is not written by cynics," that really got me, Pete said, cutting into his eggs. It reminded me of my old man. Worked at the steel plant for 40 years, never complained, never gave up on believing things could get better. Across from him, Carl smirked and took a long sip of his coffee. You're getting soft in your old age, Pete. That guy talked a good game, sure, but talking nice ain't the same thing as leading a country. Yet even Carl couldn't hide the way his eyes kept drifting to the television in the corner, where the clip was playing for what seemed like the 100th time that morning. In a high school classroom in Fresno, California, a history teacher made a decision that would be repeated in schools across the country. She paused her planned lesson, pulled up the video on the classroom smartboard, and played Obama's words for her students. The room went completely quiet, a rare occurrence that any teacher would recognize as significant. A few students whispered each other as Obama's voice carried across the classroom, speaking about persistence and belief in democracy. When the recording ended, the teacher asked a question that would spark discussion for the entire period. "So, what does leadership sound like to you?" A boy in the back raised his hand thoughtfully. "It sounds like someone who actually cares whether we make it or not." Another student added, "It's not even about politics anymore. It's about believing that people can do good things if someone reminds them they matter." For the rest of the class period, they debated what those words meant to them personally. Some remained skeptical. Others felt genuinely inspired, but every single student was engaged in a way that surprised their teacher. In homes across America where political conversations often turned into shouting matches, the recording became something unprecedented, a pause button that allowed families to have civil discussions about leadership without immediately retreating to their partisan corners. In Madison, Wisconsin, the Whitaker family sat around their dinner table, plates half empty and forgotten, as Obama's address played on the television in the adjoining living room. When it ended, their teenage daughter spoke up with a kind of clarity that only comes from genuine reflection. That doesn't sound unfit for leadership. That sounds steady and reassuring. Her father, a lifelong Republican who usually had quick and fiery rebuttals to anything Obama-related, stabbed his fork into his mashed potatoes and muttered, "Steady doesn't necessarily mean right about everything." But the notable lack of his usual passionate disagreement spoke louder than any words could have. The phenomenon was spreading to barbershops, beauty salons, grocery store checkout lines, and bus stops. Americans weren't all reaching the same conclusions, but they were listening to each other and engaging with the ideas in ways that had become rare in the polarized political landscape. For many people, the conversation wasn't even specifically about Barack Obama as a person or politician. It was about remembering a tone, a style of leadership communication that felt absent from the current political moment. In late-night diners in Albuquerque, older veterans swapped stories about speeches from decades past that had kept them going through difficult times. On a crowded subway car in Boston, a young woman played the audio on her phone speaker. The strangers packed shoulder to shoulder around her went quiet, some closing their eyes and letting Obama's voice wash over them as if it were more than just politics, as if it were a reminder of something essential they had lost track of. But the response wasn't uniformly positive or nostalgic. Real anger and frustration surfaced in many places. At a VFW hall in Fort Worth, a group of men erupted at the television when the clip aired yet again during the evening news. One veteran slammed his beer bottle down so hard that foam spilled over the rim and across the scarred wooden table. "This is complete garbage," he shouted. "They're trying to turn him into some kind of saint. He's not one of us. Never was, never will be." His friend, sitting across the table, argued back with equal passion. "Maybe he's not one of us, but you've got to admit the man knows how to speak to people. That's why they listen to him." The exchange nearly escalated into a full shouting match before the bartender stepped in, muttering that politics always had a way of ruining what should have been a peaceful evening among friends. The division was real and deep, but the underlying truth was undeniable. People were reacting strongly in both directions. They weren't ignoring the recording, changing the channel, or scrolling past it on their feeds. They were stopping, listening, and grappling with what they heard. In a country where attention spans have been fractured by endless distractions and news cycles that lasted mere hours, that kind of sustained engagement meant something powerful was happening in the American consciousness. Meanwhile, Trump's inner circle was scrambling behind the scenes. At a high-dollar fundraiser in a Manhattan penthouse, several wealthy donors whispered their concerns over crystal glasses of expensive wine. The optics of the situation were becoming impossible to ignore. "We can't afford unforced errors like this," one major contributor muttered, leaning across a polished mahogany table. "The narrative is getting away from us completely." Another donor, whose checks had funded multiple Trump campaigns, replied grimly, "This isn't just about optics anymore. This is about political erosion. Every time he attacks like this, he gives his opponents exactly what they need: relevance and sympathy." The media ecosystem continued to amplify the story in ways that defied traditional political logic. Cable networks that usually moved on to new controversies every 24 hours kept returning to recording, playing it in different contexts, and analyzing its impact from every conceivable angle. MSNBC framed Obama's original response as an example of steady, principled leadership under pressure. CNN called it a contrast moment that highlighted different approaches to public communication. Even Fox News found itself internally divided, with some anchors reluctantly admitting that Obama's restraint and tone had been politically effective. He didn't need to say much to come out ahead in this exchange, one conservative commentator observed during a panel discussion. Sometimes the most powerful response is the one that doesn't escalate the conflict. The ripple effects began reaching into the halls of Congress, where several Republican lawmakers privately expressed frustration that the entire episode had become an unintended gift to Democrats. One senior aide leaked to a reporter that there were growing concerns within the party about the president's political instincts and strategic decision-making. That leak generated headlines of its own, creating a secondary news cycle about internal Republican tensions over Trump's approach to attacking Obama. The story was developing layers and complications that made it impossible to contain or redirect. Even in traditionally conservative strongholds, the response was more nuanced than anyone had expected. At a coffee shop in Milwaukee, a group of young professionals found themselves in an animated discussion over their morning lattes. "I'm not even particularly interested in politics most of the time," one woman admitted. But the difference in tone is just obvious. One approach is all about shouting and dividing people, while the other reminds you why you should care about your community. Her colleague nodded in agreement. It's like watching two job interviews for the same position. One candidate rants about their competitors, while the other speaks with quiet authority about bringing out the best in people. Who would you actually want to work for? Heads nodded around their small table, a recognition passing between them that transcended partisan politics. Meanwhile, on the streets of Philadelphia, something remarkable and spontaneous occurred. A small rally formed organically, without any official organization or planning. People began gathering with hastily made signs featuring Obama's most powerful quotes written in bold marker. "History is not written by cynics," and "Keep believing in each other." A local news crew captured footage of a grandmother holding a simple placard with the phrase, "Keep believing," written in her own handwriting. When the reporter asked her why she'd come out, she smiled warmly into the camera. "He's not even running for anything, but he's still giving us hope." That matters more than people realize. Inside the West Wing, the mood was growing darker with each passing hour. Senior advisors found themselves drafting and redrafting talking points, trying to spin the clip as evidence of inappropriate interference by a former president. But none of their messaging seemed to stick or gain traction in the broader cultural conversation. Aides whispered in hallways that Trump was beyond furious, describing him as pacing the Oval Office and muttering that the media was orchestrating a campaign to crown Obama all over again. The frustration was eating away at the administration's confidence and focus. Late-night comedy shows sharpened their commentary with surgical precision. One host played the clip side by side with Trump's increasingly agitated tweets about media bias, then delivered a punchline that captured the absurdity perfectly. It's like someone tried to play a horror movie but accidentally hit the inspirational playlist on Spotify instead. The audience erupted in laughter, and by morning the joke itself was trending across social media platforms, adding another layer of cultural commentary to the ongoing phenomenon. But beneath all the humor and political analysis, something more serious and lasting was taking shape. Ordinary Americans were beginning to engage with fundamental questions that went far beyond partisan politics. What kind of leadership did they actually want? Did they prefer the constant confrontation and conflict that had become the norm, or were they hungry for the kind of calm reassurance they had just been reminded existed? A political science professor at the University of Michigan captured the moment's significance in an op-ed that will be widely quoted. Trump intended to expose Obama's alleged unfitness for leadership. Instead, he accidentally exposed the deep hunger Americans still have for leaders who remind them of their better angels rather than their worst impulses. In trying to diminish Obama, he gave him what politicians crave most: renewed relevance. The story began attracting international attention as well. European newspapers framed it as Obama's unexpected return to the global spotlight. Canadian outlets noted the supreme irony of Trump elevating his political rival completely by accident. What had started as an American political story was becoming a case study in leadership communication that resonated far beyond U.S. borders. By the end of that remarkable week, whispers throughout Washington were growing louder and more persistent. Was Barack Obama preparing to step back into the political arena in some capacity? Was this moment going to serve as a launching pad for a more active role in Democratic politics? Obama's closest advisors quickly dismissed such speculation, insisting publicly that the former president had no interest in returning to electoral politics. But the speculation refused to die down, fueled by the overwhelming positive response to his unintended viral moment. Inside the White House, one exhausted senior advisor finally said what everyone was thinking during a late-night strategy session. We didn't just give him free publicity. We gave him a second act on the national stage, and he didn't even have to ask for it. His colleague replied with the grim recognition of someone watching a political disaster unfold in slow motion. And the worst part is, he handled it perfectly. He didn't attack. He didn't gloat. He just reminded people why they used to trust him. But while the immediate political fallout continued to rattle Trump's inner circle, the deeper cultural impact of this extraordinary moment wasn't being measured in polls or cable news ratings. It was being felt in the quiet recognition spreading across America that there might be a different way to think about leadership, one based on building people up rather than tearing them down. 3 days after the initial press conference, as the cultural wildfire continued to spread across social media platforms and into everyday conversations, all eyes began turning toward Chicago. The question on everyone's mind was simple but loaded with potential consequences. How would Barack Obama himself respond to this unprecedented situation? His response could either amplify the momentum that had been building or potentially diffuse it entirely. Political observers, journalists, and ordinary Americans alike held their breath, waiting to see if Obama would seize this unexpected moment or let it pass quietly into history. Chicago's South Side had grown accustomed to occasional media attention whenever Barack Obama returned home, but this situation was entirely different in scale and intensity. By the third day after Trump's fateful press conference, camera crews formed long lines along the sidewalks outside the Obama Foundation headquarters. Reporters braced themselves against the sharp, cold wind coming off Lake Michigan, waiting for any word, any statement, any sign of how the former president planned to handle this extraordinary circumstance. Inside the building, Obama sat in a modest conference room, his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair, and his sleeves rolled up in a casual but dignified manner that had become his trademark. Staff members hovered nearby, fielding an endless stream of phone calls from journalists, political allies, and curious observers who all wanted to know the same thing. How was he planning to respond to what everyone was calling the political gift of a lifetime? Obama had watched the clip spread across the internet with the same calm detachment that had characterized his approach to crises during his presidency. He hadn't asked for this viral moment, hadn't planned it, hadn't even known the recording existed in any public forum. But he understood, with the political wisdom that comes from years of experience, exactly why it had resonated so powerfully with people. Mr. President, one of his closest advisors, said carefully, the networks are running the story nonstop. Social media is framing it as a direct contrast in leadership styles. If you don't say something soon, other people will fill in the blanks and control the narrative for you. Obama leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in a contemplative gesture that anyone who had worked with him would recognize. When he spoke, his voice carried the same measured tone that had made him famous. If I do respond to this, it can't be about me personally. It has to be about the country, about what we owe each other as Americans. For 2 full days, speculation had swirled through political circles and social media platforms. Would Obama attack Trump directly in response? Would he dismiss the entire controversy as unworthy of comment? Or would he let the moment pass naturally, leaving interpretation entirely to the public and the media? When he finally made his decision, the announcement was characteristically understated. A simple press release went out to major news organizations. Barack Obama would make a brief statement from his Chicago home, streamed live online for anyone who wanted to watch. No grand event, no flashy production, no dramatic buildup. Just a former president speaking directly into a camera. That evening, as clocks across the country struck 8 p.m. Eastern Time, millions of Americans tuned in from every conceivable location. Families gathered in living rooms, college students watched on laptops in dorm rooms, and long-haul truck drivers propped their phones on dashboards at highway rest stops. The screen faded in to reveal Obama sitting at a simple wooden desk, with a faint outline of bookshelves visible behind him. The setting was intimate, personal, almost conversational. When he began speaking, it was with that familiar, measured tone that had the power to make millions of people stop what they were doing and pay attention. Over the past few days, he began, a recording of mine has been shared widely across the country. It wasn't meant for a national audience or the world stage. It was simply a conversation with young community leaders in Detroit, a reminder to them that their voices and their work matter deeply to the future of our democracy. He paused, allowing the silence to work as effectively as his words, creating space for his message to resonate. But now that it's out there, now that people have heard it, I want to take a moment to speak directly to all of you across the country. Viewers found themselves leaning forward, drawn in by the intimacy and directness of his approach. In Cleveland, a retired teacher turned up the volume on her television. In Phoenix, a group of college students sat cross-legged on a dorm room floor, listening with unusual focus and attention. In Atlanta, a father muted his phone and gently shushed his children, wanting to hear every single word. Obama continued, his cadence deliberate and steady, each word chosen with the precision of someone who understood the weight of the moment. What you heard on that recording wasn't a political strategy or an attack on anyone currently in office. It was simply the truth as I see it, that America is stronger when we lift each other up instead of tearing each other down. That democracy only works when we believe in one another's capacity for good. That leadership isn't measured by how loudly we speak, but by how faithfully we listen to the hopes and concerns of the people we serve. The power of his response lay not just in what he said, but in what he didn't say. He never mentioned Trump's name, not once during the entire address. He didn't need to. The contrast was crystal clear, without any direct references or accusations. Then Obama leaned slightly closer to the camera, his voice taking on a more personal, intimate quality. I want to speak especially to the young people who may be hearing my words for the first time outside of a history classroom or a social media clip. Don't let cynicism convince you that your voice doesn't matter. Don't let anyone tell you that democracy is someone else's responsibility. It belongs to you, to all of us, and it requires all of us to make it work. The entire address lasted less than 8 minutes. There were no theatrical gestures, no raised voice, no anger or bitterness. Just a quiet, pointed reminder of the message of unity and hope that had originally carried him into the presidency years earlier. When he finished, his closing was as simple and direct as everything that had come before. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you, and please keep believing in each other. The live stream ended immediately. No questions from reporters. No dramatic flourishes. No political fireworks. Just silence. But across the nation, that silence was immediately filled with an explosion of conversation and reaction. In diners from coast to coast, customers applauded quietly at the television screens mounted above lunch counters. In college dorm rooms, students replayed the clip and began recording their own reaction videos to share with friends. On social media, new hashtags began trending almost instantly. Hashtag Keep Believing reached the top of Twitter's trending topics within an hour of Obama's address ending. Even some of Obama's harshest critics found themselves grudgingly admitting that his response had been masterfully handled. A conservative columnist in Dallas wrote a piece that will be quoted extensively. I disagree with Barack Obama on virtually every major policy issue, but I'll admit that was one of the most disciplined and effective political responses I've ever witnessed. He didn't attack. He didn't grandstand. He didn't try to score cheap points. He just reminded people of what they feel they've been missing. Inside the White House, senior staff members watched Obama's live address in what can only be described as stunned silence. When it ended, one turned to another and whispered words that captured the magnitude of what just occurred. That's it. That's all he had to do. 8 minutes of calm, steady leadership, and he's completely reclaimed control of this entire narrative. Trump himself was reportedly beyond furious, storming between offices in the West Wing and demanding to know why news networks were replaying Obama's address on continuous loops. But by that point, the story had evolved far beyond Trump's ability to control or redirect it. The political earthquake that had begun with a failed attack was now generating aftershocks that would be felt for weeks to come. And as the dust began to settle, polling organizations, donor networks, and voter sentiment would send signals that would rattle Trump's political operation even more profoundly. By the morning after Obama's carefully crafted response, hard numbers began telling a story that was even more dramatic than the anecdotal evidence suggests. Quick turnaround polling conducted by several major organizations revealed a noticeable and significant shift among independent voters, the crucial swing demographic that both parties constantly compete to win. Obama's favorability ratings had surged dramatically overnight. One poll showed an extraordinary 12-point jump among Americans under 35, with respondents saying that the recording and Obama's response had made them feel more optimistic about the future of American leadership. The White House initially tried to dismiss these numbers as statistical noise or media manipulation. Trump's press secretary stepped to the podium with her usual confidence, insisting, "The former president is attempting to manipulate the American people with flowery rhetoric and empty promises. The current president remains focused on delivering real results for working families." But her prepared talking points crumbled when a reporter raised his hand with a follow-up question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. If that's the case, why are the president's own approval numbers dropping in these same overnight polls? Her smile faltered visibly, and the briefing ended more abruptly than anyone had expected, leaving questions hanging in the air and creating yet another news cycle within the larger story. In communities across the country, voters who hadn't paid serious attention to politics in years suddenly found themselves re-engaging with fundamental questions about leadership and governance. In Pittsburgh, a retired steelworker told a local television reporter, "I don't care who you voted for or what party you belong to. When someone speaks with that kind of conviction and hope, it stirs something inside you that's been sleeping." In Seattle, a young entrepreneur posted a video response that captured what many millennials were feeling. "I wasn't old enough to vote for Obama when he was president, but hearing that recording made me realize what leadership used to feel like before everything became about conflict and division." The political donor class was growing increasingly restless and concerned. Behind closed doors at exclusive fundraisers and private dinners, major contributors to Trump's campaigns began expressing doubts about the political strategy and messaging approach that had led to the self-inflicted wound. One mega donor, speaking on condition of anonymity, told a political reporter, "We can't continue to fund campaigns that create these kinds of unforced errors. The political marketplace is unforgiving, and this kind of miscalculation could have lasting consequences." Cable news networks seized on the narrative momentum and fed it in endless programming loops. The story had everything that television producers dream of: conflict, irony, clear protagonists, and genuine cultural impact that extended far beyond a typical political insider audience. MSNBC anchors framed Obama's handling of the situation as a textbook example of grace under pressure. CNN political analysts called it a masterclass in political communication. Even Fox News found itself struggling with internal divisions, as some hosts and commentators reluctantly acknowledged that Obama's restrained response had been strategically brilliant. You have to give credit where it's due. One Fox anchor admitted during a panel discussion, he didn't take the bait, he didn't escalate the conflict, and he managed to look presidential without even trying to be political. The ripple effect spread into Congress, where Republican lawmakers privately fumed that the entire episode had become a strategic gift to their Democratic opponents. Several GOP aides leaked stories to reporters suggesting that there were growing internal concerns about Trump's political judgment and his tendency to create unnecessary controversies. These leaks generated their own headlines and news cycles, creating a compounding effect that made the original story even more damaging to Trump's political standing. The narrative was spinning beyond anyone's ability to control or contain it, but the impact wasn't limited to political elites or media commentary. In break rooms at factories across the Midwest, workers found themselves having conversations about leadership that went far deeper than typical political discussions. At a manufacturing plant in Akron, Ohio, Maria Delgado replayed the clip on her smartphone during lunch break while her co-workers gathered around, chewing their sandwiches and listening with genuine attention. When Obama's words finished echoing through the noisy break room, one of her colleagues sighed deeply. "That's completely different from what we usually hear from politicians these days," he observed. "Feels like someone actually talking to us instead of talking at us or around us." Maria nodded thoughtfully. "It's like he remembers that we're real people with real problems, not just voting demographics to be manipulated." The cultural impact was being measured not in poll numbers or television ratings, but in these kind of organic conversations. Casual comments between neighbors, discussions around family dinner tables, debates in coffee shops and community centers. People were quoting a man who wasn't even running for office, which suggested something profound about the state of American political discourse. By the time that extraordinary week came to an end, the speculation about Obama's political future was reaching a fever pitch. Political talk shows dedicated entire segments to analyzing whether this moment might serve as a launching pad for Obama to take a more active role in Democratic politics, perhaps as a kingmaker or senior statesman who could help heal divisions within the party. Inside the White House, one completely exhausted senior advisor finally articulated what everyone was thinking during a late-night emergency strategy session. We didn't just give him unexpected publicity. We handed him a complete political resurrection, and he didn't even have to ask for it. His colleague replied with the grim recognition of someone watching a carefully planned strategy collapse in real time. And the absolute worst part is that he played it perfectly. He stayed above the fray. He looked presidential, and he made us look petty and vindictive by comparison. The political fallout continued to reverberate through Trump's inner circle, but the deeper cultural impact of this extraordinary moment was being measured in something far more significant than polling data or cable news ratings. It was being felt in the quiet but growing recognition among ordinary Americans that there might be a fundamentally different approach to political leadership, one based on inspiring people rather than dividing them, on building bridges rather than burning them down. The dust from political controversies usually settles quickly in our fast-paced news environment. Most scandals spark brightly, dominate headlines for a few days, then fade into the background as the relentless news cycle moves on to the next crisis or conflict. But this story refused to follow that familiar pattern. It lingered, took root, and continued growing in ways that surprised even the most experienced political observers. The image of Trump slamming that laptop shut in obvious frustration, paired with the memory of Obama's calm, steady voice still echoing across the country, remained vivid in the public consciousness far longer than anyone had expected. What made this moment last wasn't just the political rivalry between two presidents or the partisan reactions from Democrats and Republicans. It was the fact that ordinary people, families in small towns, students in crowded classrooms, retirees in quiet suburban neighborhoods, found themselves stopping in the middle of their daily routines to ask a fundamental question. What does authentic leadership actually sound like? In Miami, a Cuban-American grandfather sat on his front porch, rocking slowly in his chair as his teenage granddaughter replayed the recording on her smartphone for the third time that day. When Obama's words finished, she looked up at him with a kind of innocent curiosity that cut straight to the truth. Abuelo, why are grown-ups fighting so much about this? He just sounds like he cares about people. The grandfather thought for a long moment, watching the palm trees sway in the evening breeze, before responding with the wisdom that comes from decades of observing human nature. Mija, when someone speaks directly to heart, even their enemies can't control what happens next. That observation captured the unshakable truth of what had occurred. Trump had intended to bury Obama's influence and relevance once and for all, but in attempting to do so, he had accidentally amplified a message that transcended partisan politics and touched something deeper in the American consciousness. The speech that had started this cultural phenomenon wasn't flashy or dramatic. It hadn't even been intended for national broadcast or political consumption. Yet its very authenticity, the fact that it was originally meant as private encouragement for young community organizers, was exactly why it struck so deeply into the national conversation. Back in Detroit, where those fateful words had first been spoken to a small audience of local activists, the young leaders who had heard them in person continued to feel a sense of pride mixed with amazement. Malika Foster, who had become something of a local celebrity thanks to her viral social media posts about the experience, addressed the community, gathering with words that would be quoted in newspapers across the country. What I realized this week is that real leadership doesn't always mean winning arguments or proving you're the smartest person in the room. Sometimes it just means reminding people that they matter, that their efforts count, that they shouldn't give up on each other or on the possibility of positive change. Heads nodded across the room. Not because everyone agreed with Obama's politics or policy positions, but because they understood and responded to fundamental human sentiment behind his message. Even some of Obama's traditional critics found themselves grudgingly acknowledging the power of the moment. A conservative radio host in Ohio told his listeners during his daily talk show, "Look, I disagree with that man's policies on just about everything you can imagine. But if you're being honest, If you're being fair, you have to admit that the way he handled this entire situation, it's hard to say it didn't work. His phone lines immediately lit up with callers arguing passionately in both directions. Some furious that he would give Obama any credit at all, others conceding the same point about effectiveness and tone. But the fact that people were wrestling with these ideas, that they were calling in to debate them with genuine passion, spoke volumes about the deeper impact this moment was having on American political discourse. What happened during those remarkable few days revealed more about the American people than it did about either politician involved. It demonstrated how quickly and dramatically a political narrative could backfire when it was driven by anger and personal animosity rather than vision and hope. It showed how words meant for encouragement and inspiration could outlive their original context, taking root in places and hearts that no campaign strategist could have predicted or planned for. And above all, it proved that sometimes true strength isn't measured by volume or aggression, but by the kind of calm conviction that can inspire people to believe in their better angels instead of their worst impulses. In the weeks that followed, political columnists and commentators reached for metaphors to describe what they had witnessed. Some called it a political boomerang that had returned to strike its thrower. Others described it as Trump lighting a match in the darkness, only to reveal someone else already holding a torch that burned much brighter. But outside the world of headlines and punditry, in the quiet spaces where ordinary Americans live their daily lives, the lesson was simpler and more profound. At a church service in Indianapolis, a pastor summed up the moral of the story in his Sunday sermon. Tearing down your neighbor might make you feel strong for a moment, but lifting them up makes you remembered for a lifetime. That was exactly what had happened. And everyone could see it clearly. Trump's attack didn't define or diminish Obama. If anything, it had elevated him and reminded people of qualities they admired. By contrast, Obama's response reminded millions of Americans of something they realized they had been missing. Steadiness, reassurance, a voice that believed in them more than it believed in itself. The moral lesson was clear, even for those who initially resisted it or tried to find alternative explanations. When leaders use their platforms to divide and attack, they might win a news cycle or score temporary political points, but they lose something more valuable, the trust and respect of the people they're supposed to serve. When leaders use their influence to encourage and inspire, their words last far beyond the immediate applause or criticism. Weeks later, as the initial frenzy cooled and other news stories claimed the headlines, Obama's recording was still being quoted and referenced in unexpected places. High school seniors incorporated his words into graduation speeches. Youth sports coaches taped excerpts to locker room walls as motivation for their teams. Families found themselves referencing his message during everyday conversations about perseverance and community responsibility. The recording had completely transcended its original audience and political context. It had become part of the broader American cultural conversation, woven into the fabric of how people thought about leadership, hope, and their responsibilities to each other. And in the end, that transformation revealed the supreme irony of Trump's miscalculation. He had set out to strip Obama of relevance and influence, to prove once and for all that his predecessor was unfit for any kind of leadership role. Instead, he had given Obama something that even time and political opposition struggled to erase: genuine cultural resonance that connected with people's deepest values and aspirations. For the millions of Americans who listened to that recording, whether they agreed with Obama's politics or not, whether they had voted for him or against him, the lesson was unmistakable and universal. True strength isn't proven by calling others unfit or by tearing down your opponents. Real leadership is demonstrated by showing people why they matter, by reminding them of their own capacity for good, and by encouraging them never to give up on each other. Perhaps that's where this remarkable story truly ends. Not in the chaos of that press room, not in the viral hashtags or cable news debates, not in the shouting matches on social media platforms. It ends in the lasting question that this moment left embedded in the American consciousness. What kind of leadership do we actually want to follow? For every person who heard this story, regardless of their political beliefs or party affiliations, the takeaway is worth holding onto and thinking about deeply. Because whether you lean left, right, or somewhere in the complicated middle, the fundamental lesson is universal and timeless. Words of power. They can tear down or they can build up. One approach might dominate a single news cycle, but the other has the power to influence and inspire entire generations. If you found meaning in this story, remember that there will always be more moments like these scattered throughout our political and cultural landscape. More lessons tucked inside the noise and chaos of daily headlines. More opportunities to choose between the leadership that divides us and the leadership that reminds us of our shared humanity and common hopes. Sometimes the most powerful revelations don't come from what's said against someone, but from what's revealed about all of us, our capacity for hope, our hunger for authentic leadership, and our deep desire to believe that tomorrow can be better than today if we choose to lift each other up instead of tearing each other down.